The sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood as the elderly woman stepped out of her modest home. She adjusted her glasses and smoothed out her dress, taking a deep breath. Today was the day. She was finally going to buy a new car. Her old one had given up after years of faithful service, and she needed something reliable. She had saved up for this moment, carefully setting aside money from her pension checks. The car dealership wasn't far, just a short bus ride away. She didn't mind public transportation, it had been her way of getting around for years. As she waited at the bus stop, she clutched her handbag a little tighter, feeling both excited and nervous. She had heard stories about pushy salesmen, but she hoped she'd find someone kind who would treat her with respect. When she arrived at the dealership, the place was already buzzing with activity. Shiny new cars gleamed under the bright lights, and salespeople in crisp suits moved around, chatting with customers. She walked in slowly, taking it all in. Almost immediately, she noticed the glances, some curious, some indifferent, a few that felt dismissive. But she ignored them and approached the nearest salesman. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I'd like to look at a car, please." The salesman, a young man with slicked back hair, barely looked up from his phone. "Sure, take a look around," he mumbled before walking away to greet another customer, a younger man in a suit who had just walked in. The woman frowned but didn't say anything. She wandered through the rows of cars, running her fingers over the smooth paint, peeking inside at the leather seats. Every time she tried to ask a question, the salespeople seemed too busy or uninterested. One even smirked when she asked about financing options. "Ma'am, these cars are pretty expensive," he said, chuckling. "Maybe you should check out the used lot down the street." Her heart sank. She knew what was happening. It wasn't the first time she had been treated differently because of her age or the color of her skin. But she wasn't going to let it ruin her day. She straightened her back and decided to try one more time. Just as she was about to approach another salesman, the doors of the dealership swung open. A tall, well-dressed man walked in, his presence commanding attention. The sales team suddenly perked up, rushing to greet him. The elderly woman's eyes widened. She recognized that face. It was her son. And he wasn't just any customer. He was a billionaire. The room seemed to freeze as he walked straight toward her, ignoring the eager salesman trailing behind him. "Mom," he said warmly, kissing her cheek. "I told you I'd come with you. Why didn't you wait?" The look on the sales team's faces was priceless. Their smug smiles vanished, replaced by shock and panic. The woman smiled softly, patting her son's arm. "I wanted to do this on my own," she said. "But I guess some things never change." Her son's expression darkened as he glanced around at the salespeople. "Oh," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I think things are about to change." The air in the dealership grew thick with tension as the billionaire's son stood beside his mother, his sharp gaze sweeping over the stunned sales team. Just moments ago, they had ignored her, now, they couldn't look away. The salesman who had smirked at her earlier shifted uncomfortably, his face turning pale. The manager, a middle-aged man in a too-tight suit, rushed forward, his forced smile twitching at the corners. "Sir. Welcome to our dealership," the manager said, his voice overly cheerful. "Is there anything we can help you with today?" The son didn't return the smile. Instead, he gently guided his mother to a nearby chair, making sure she was comfortable before turning back to the manager. "Actually," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge, "my mother was here first. And from what I saw, none of you were in a hurry to help her." A heavy silence fell. The salesman exchanged nervous glances. The manager cleared his throat, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Oh, I'm sure there's just been a misunderstanding," he stammered. "We would never." "Misunderstanding?" The son raised an eyebrow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he pulled up a video, security footage from the dealership's own cameras. It showed his mother being brushed off, ignored, and even laughed at when she asked about prices. The manager's mouth opened, but no words came out. The billionaire didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word was measured, deliberate. My mother worked 2 jobs her whole life to raise me. She saved every penny to give me opportunities she never had. And today, she wanted to buy her first new car with her own money, something she's earned. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But instead of treating her with respect, you dismissed her. Judged her. Why? Because of how she looks? Because she's older? Because she didn't walk in here flashing a gold card? The manager swallowed hard. Sir, I assure you, this isn't how we do business. We value every customer. Do you? The son glanced around at the other customers in the showroom, who had stopped browsing to watch the scene unfold. Then why did it take me walking in here for anyone to take her seriously? One of the salesmen, a younger guy who had earlier rolled his eyes at the elderly woman, suddenly stepped forward. Look, man, I didn't mean anything by it, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. It's just, we get a lot of people who can't afford these cars, and you decide who can afford what based on what, the billionaire cut in. Their shoes? Their age? Their skin color? The salesman's face flushed. He had no answer. The mother, sitting quietly, finally spoke up. It's all right, baby, she said softly, placing a hand on her son's arm. I'm used to it. That broke him. His stern expression softened for just a second before he turned back to the manager. No. It's not all right. He took a deep breath. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my mother, properly. Then, you're going to show her every car on this lot with the same respect you'd give me. And if she chooses one, you're going to make sure she gets the best deal possible. No tricks. No hidden fees. The manager nodded eagerly. Of course, sir. Absolutely. Ma'am, I'm so sorry for the way you were treated. Let me personally assist you. But the billionaire wasn't finished. And one more thing, he said, his voice dropping lower. I want every employee in this building to go through sensitivity training. Because if this happens again, to anyone, I'll make sure the whole world knows exactly what kind of business you're running. The threat wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The message was clear. As the manager hurried off to gather the staff, the son knelt beside his mother. You okay? He asked gently. She patted his cheek, her eyes warm but tired. I just wanted a car, baby. Didn't mean to cause all this fuss. He smiled for the first time since walking in. You didn't cause it. They did. Nearby, the other customers whispered among themselves. An older couple nodded in approval. A young woman pulled out her phone, discreetly recording. The atmosphere in the dealership had shifted. Suddenly, the sales team couldn't be more attentive. But the real test was yet to come. Because the mother hadn't decided if she even wanted to buy from this place anymore. And her son had one more card to play. The dealership had gone eerily quiet after the son's words. The usual hum of sales pitches and engine demonstrations had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the occasional nervous cough. The sales staff stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The manager's forced smile had long since disappeared, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his forehead. The elderly woman sat in the chair her son had guided her to, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't one for drama, and this whole scene was more attention than she had ever wanted. But as she looked at her son, his sharp suit, his unshakable posture, she couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when they had nothing. The son noticed the way his mother's fingers tightened slightly around her purse strap, a small tell that she was remembering too. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning back to the manager. "You want to know why this matters so much?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "Let me tell you who my mother really is." And with that, the room slipped into the past. 25 years earlier, in a small apartment with peeling paint and a fridge that sometimes didn't work, a single mother worked the night shift at a diner. She'd come home just in time to wake her son for school, her feet aching, her uniform smelling of grease and coffee. She'd make him breakfast, oatmeal if they had it, toast if they didn't, and then she'd walk him to the bus stop before heading to her second job cleaning offices. Money was tight. There were months when the electricity got cut off, when dinner was a can of soup split between them. But she never let her son see her cry. Instead, she'd tell him stories about how one day, things would be different. "You're going to do big things," she'd say, smoothing his hair. "And when you do, you'll remember where you came from." Her son was smart, brilliant, really, but schools in their neighborhood weren't exactly handing out opportunities. When he got accepted to a better school across town, she didn't hesitate. She took on a third job to pay for the bus passes and second-hand uniforms. She stayed up late helping him with homework she barely understood herself, squinting at his textbooks under a flickering lamp. One night, he found her at the kitchen table, head in her hands. He thought she was tired, she was always tired, but when she looked up, her eyes were fierce. "Don't you ever let anyone make you feel small," she told him. "Not because of where you live, not because of what we don't have. You hear me?" He heard her. Back in the dealership, the son's voice was steady as he finished the story. "That woman you ignored today is the reason I'm standing here. She's the reason I had the chance to build what I have." He looked at his mother, his expression softening. "And she's still the strongest person I know." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier, more thoughtful. The young salesman who had rolled his eyes earlier stared at the floor, his face burning with shame. The manager opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. The elderly woman stood then, smoothing her dress with hands that had worked a lifetime. "I don't need special treatment," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I just wanted the same respect anyone else would get walking in here." Her son nodded. "And now?" he asked her. "What do you want to do now?" She looked around the showroom, at the gleaming cars, at the sales staff who couldn't meet her eyes. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn checkbook. "I'd like to see that blue sedan," she said. "The one nobody thought I could afford." The manager nearly tripped over himself in his haste to get the keys. The manager practically sprinted to fetch the keys for the blue sedan, his polished shoes squeaking against the showroom floor. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the key ring, nearly dropping it twice before finally clutching it tight. "Right this way, ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward the car. The elderly woman walked slowly, taking her time. She wasn't in any hurry now. The sales staff who had ignored her earlier now hovered nearby like nervous shadows, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The young salesman who had suggested the used car lot trailed behind the group, his earlier smirk long gone. As they reached the sedan, the manager rushed to open the driver's side door with a dramatic flourish. "Our top-of-the-line model," he said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. "Premium leather seats, advanced safety features, and—" "I'd like to sit in it alone for a moment," the woman interrupted gently. The manager blinked. "Oh. Of course." He stepped back quickly, nearly bumping into the billionaire son, who stood with his arms crossed, watching everything with sharp eyes. The woman slid into the driver's seat, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The leather was smooth and cool under her fingers. She adjusted the rearview mirror out of habit, though she wasn't planning to drive it just yet. For a long moment, she just sat there, breathing in the new car smell, thinking about how many years it had been since she'd owned something truly new. Outside the car, the atmosphere was tense. The manager kept glancing at the billionaire, opening his mouth as if to say something, then closing it again. Finally, he couldn't stand the silence. "Sir, I want to assure you." "Don't talk to me," the son said quietly. "This is her moment. Not yours." Inside the car, the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo, a faded picture of her younger self standing beside a rusted old station wagon, her then little boy grinning next to her. That car had broken down more times than she could count, but it had gotten them where they needed to go. She touched the photo lightly before tucking it away again. When she finally stepped out of the sedan, everyone straightened up like soldiers at attention. "It's a nice car," she said simply. The manager jumped at the opening. "We can offer you an exceptional deal today. 0% financing, free maintenance for." "I'll be paying in full," she said, reaching for her checkbook again. The manager's mouth opened and closed. Behind him, several salesmen exchanged shocked looks. The billionaire son's lips twitched, the closest he'd come to a smile since entering the dealership. "But before I do," the woman continued, "I have one question." She turned to face the manager directly. "If my son hadn't walked in here today, would any of you have treated me differently?" The silence was absolute. The manager's throat worked as he struggled to find an answer that wouldn't dig him deeper. The truth hung heavy in the air between them. It was the young salesman, the one who had been so dismissive earlier, who finally spoke up. "No, ma'am," he said quietly, looking at his shoes. "We wouldn't have." The woman nodded, as if she'd expected nothing else. She began writing the check with careful, deliberate strokes. Just then, the dealership doors burst open. A TV news crew rushed in, cameras already rolling. The billionaire son didn't look surprised. The manager went pale. "What? How? Who called them?" The son finally smiled properly then. "I did." The sudden arrival of the news crew sent a shockwave through the dealership. Camera lights flicked on, bathing the showroom in harsh white light that made the manager's sweat gleam unnaturally on his forehead. A reporter in a sharp blazer zeroed in on the billionaire's son immediately, microphone thrust forward like a weapon. "Mr. Whitmore," the reporter said, "your office tipped us off about possible discriminatory practices at this dealership. Care to comment?" The elderly woman's hand froze mid-signature on her check. She looked up at her son, one eyebrow raised in silent question. He gave her the smallest shrug, an unspoken apology for not warning her, but no regret for doing it. The manager made a strangled noise in his throat. "Now wait just a minute." But the billionaire was already speaking to the cameras, his voice measured but carrying. "My mother came here today to buy a car with her hard-earned savings. What she got instead was ignored, dismissed, and directed to the used lot before I arrived." He turned slightly, making sure the cameras caught his mother's dignified expression. "How many other people get treated this way when they walk through those doors?" Chaos erupted. Two other customers, a middle-aged Hispanic man and a young black woman, suddenly stepped forward. "Same thing happened to me last week," the man said loudly. "Asked about financing and they handed me a subprime loan packet." The young woman nodded vigorously. "I came in wearing scrubs after my nursing shift and they wouldn't even let me test drive." The cameras swung to capture their testimonials. The manager looked like he might pass out. Meanwhile, the elderly woman finished writing her check with one final flourish. She held it out to the manager, who took it automatically, his fingers numb with shock. The amount written was for the full sticker price, no haggling, no discounts. "I believe this covers it," she said calmly. Then, louder so the cameras could hear, "though I do wonder what price they quoted me before realizing who my son was." The reporter's eyes lit up. "Ma'am, would you be willing to?" "No interviews," the billionaire cut in smoothly. "Not until the car is in her driveway with the paperwork finalized." He plucked the check from the manager's limp fingers and handed it to a different salesman, the one who had admitted their earlier prejudice. "You process this now." The young salesman scrambled to obey, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. As the news crew continued filming the growing crowd of aggrieved customers, the son leaned down to whisper in his mother's ear. "Too much." She patted his cheek. "Always with the drama, baby." "But..." She glanced at the other customers now sharing their stories, at the manager frantically dialing his corporate office. Maybe this needed to happen. The billionaire pulled out his phone and tapped once. Every television screen in the dealership, the fancy wall-mounted displays meant to showcase car features, suddenly switched to a live social media feed. The hashtag Fair Deal for All was already trending, with their dealership's name attached. The manager made a sound like a deflating balloon. The dealership had turned into pure pandemonium. Phones were ringing non-stop, corporate headquarters, local news stations, customers demanding explanations. The manager kept mopping his forehead with a now soggy handkerchief, his eyes darting between the live news broadcast and the viral social media posts multiplying by the second. The elderly woman watched it all unfold from her seat in the newly purchased sedan, the door still open, her feet planted firmly on the ground. She wasn't hiding, just observing, the way she always had. Life had taught her that when things got loud, it was best to stay still and let the storm reveal its true shape. Her son stood nearby, arms crossed, watching as the young salesman processed her paperwork with trembling hands. Every now and then, the billionaire would glance at his mother, making sure she was okay. He knew this was overwhelming, but he also knew her quiet strength better than anyone. Then, a new commotion erupted at the entrance. A black town car screeched to a halt outside, and out stepped a gray-haired man in an expensive overcoat, clearly someone high up from the dealership's corporate office. He strode in like he owned the place, which, technically, he might have. The manager nearly collapsed in relief. "Mr. Harrington," the manager gasped. "Thank God you're here." Harrington ignored him, scanning the room until his eyes landed on the billionaire. Immediately, his demeanor shifted from authoritative to apologetic. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, extending a hand. "I had no idea this was happening at one of our locations. Please, let me make this right." The billionaire didn't shake his hand. "It's not me you need to apologize to." Harrington turned to the elderly woman, his smile strained but sincere. "Ma'am, on behalf of our entire company, I deeply apologize for the disrespect you faced today. We'll be issuing a full refund, of course, and I'd like to offer you any car on this lot at no cost." The woman held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I don't want a free car," she said calmly. "I already paid for this one. Fair and square." Harrington blinked. "But what I do want," she continued, her voice steady, "is to know what you're going to do to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else tomorrow. Or the next day. Or next year." The room fell silent again, all eyes on Harrington. Even the news cameras waited, zooming in for his response. Harrington cleared his throat. "We'll discipline those involved, of course. Mandatory sensitivity training for all staff." The woman shook her head. "Training's good. But it's not enough." She glanced at her son, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Then she said the words that would change everything: "I think you need some new voices at your table." The billionaire stepped forward, pulling a business card from his pocket and handing it to Harrington. "My mother is referring to the fact that your corporate board lacks diversity. As does your executive team. And your franchise ownership agreements." He paused. "I'd like to discuss investing in your company. A substantial investment. With conditions." Harrington's mouth fell open. The manager made a noise like a deflating tire. The news reporter, sensing history in the making, shoved her microphone closer. "Mr. Whitmore, are you saying you want to buy into this dealership chain to force policy changes?" The billionaire smiled, the first real, unguarded smile he'd shown all day. "Not just this chain. The entire automotive retail industry needs a wake-up call. And who better to deliver it than the people they've been overlooking for decades?" The elderly woman finally stood from the car, smoothing her dress. All eyes turned to her as she walked over to stand beside her son. "You boys work out your business," she said lightly. But first, she held out her hand to Harrington. "Keys, please. I'd like to drive my new car home." The keys felt solid in her palm as the elderly woman slid into the driver's seat of her new sedan. The leather creaked softly beneath her, that distinctive new car smell wrapping around her like a promise. Outside, the commotion continued, reporters shouting questions, her son discussing business terms with the corporate executives, dealership staff scrambling to contain the fallout, but here, in this quiet space, it was just her and the open road waiting beyond the lot. She adjusted the mirrors with deliberate care, her hands remembering motions they hadn't performed in years. The last time she'd owned a brand new car, her son had still been in middle school. That old station wagon had seen them through so much, rainy bus stop pickups, grocery hauls, that cross-country move for her son's scholarship. She'd sold it years ago when the repairs became too costly, settling for whatever used vehicle she could afford. But today, for the first time in decades, she was starting fresh. The passenger door opened, and her son slipped inside. "All set?" he asked, buckling his seatbelt. She gave him that look, the same one she'd used when he tried staying up past bedtime as a boy. "You're not letting me drive home alone?" "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, though they both knew he'd been negotiating fiercely until 30 seconds ago. "But I do want to see your face when you press the ignition." She turned the key, and the engine purred to life with a smooth vibration that made her exhale slowly. No rattling, no ominous clicks, just pure, reliable power. The dashboard lights glowed softly, illuminating the pride in her son's eyes. Outside, the crowd had noticed her preparing to leave. The news cameras swiveled, capturing the moment the blue sedan began rolling toward the exit. But what the cameras couldn't see was the quiet conversation happening inside. "You really bought into their company?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the road ahead. "Conditionally," he admitted. "They have 60 days to implement real changes before my investment converts to equity." A beat passed. "I was thinking, you might want to sit on their diversity advisory board." Her hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "Baby, I don't know the first thing about corporate boards." "You know about people," he said simply. "And that's what they've been missing." The gates of the dealership opened before them. As they pulled onto the main road, something unexpected caught their attention: people. Dozens of them, standing along the sidewalk, cheering. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and now strangers waved signs reading, "Drive with Pride," and "Our Hero." An elderly man in a postal worker's uniform saluted as they passed. The woman's breath hitched. Her son reached over and squeezed her shoulder as she navigated slowly through the impromptu celebration. "Turns out," he murmured, "you weren't just buying a car today." The truth of that settled over her as they left the crowd behind. The road stretched before them, smooth and open. She rolled down her window, letting the breeze rush in, carrying with it the scent of possibility. "Where to, Mom?" her son asked, though he already knew the answer. She smiled and took the turn toward home, not just to her house, but to the neighborhood where she'd raised him, where neighbors still looked out for one another, where her story had begun. The sedan handled the curves effortlessly, its engine humming a quiet promise of all the roads yet to travel. And in the rearview mirror, if one looked closely, they might have noticed the dealership's marquee sign changing, not just the prices, but the words scrolling beneath them: "Equal service for all. Always." The sun dipped low as they pulled into her driveway, painting everything in golden light. Her son helped her out, and they stood for a moment, admiring the car that represented so much more than transportation. "Thank you," she said finally, not just for the vehicle, but for the day, the stand, the lifetime of love that had led them here. He kissed her forehead. "No, Mom. Thank you." Inside, the kitchen light was on, the tea kettle whistling, because of course he'd arranged for her neighbor to have everything ready. As they stepped inside, the woman glanced back one last time at her new car sitting proudly in the driveway. Tomorrow, she'd take her friends to bingo. Next week, maybe a trip to the coast. But tonight? Tonight, she'd simply enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a battle well fought, a life well lived, and a journey far from over.